Mr. Chasai,
Hi,
can you hear me?
Yes, Kaya, I can hear you quite clearly.
Okay, that's perfect. All three of you, my panelist members, are here, so we are going to start in less than a minute from now. Our technician Sean is in the studio right now. He said he just needs a minute, so we will be able to go live on Ubuntu Radio as well. Mm. Okay. Good evening and welcome to our webinar for this evening. Of course, it is hosted by the Department of International Relations and Cooperation in South Africa. My name is Kaya Goto from Ubuntu Radio, and I am going to be facilitating the conversation that we are going to be having tonight. Well, the topic that we are going to be focusing on this evening is quite something that has left the South African government quite unimpressed and unhappy. And we are talking about the unilateral decision of the African Union Commission chair to grant Israel the observer status in the AU. The question that we are asking, is that a right move or not? And I have of my panelist members, I have Mr. Zane Dango, who is the special advisor to the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation in South Africa, Dr. Naledi Pandor. I also have Mr. Mohamed Desai, who is the director at the Africa for Palestine. We also have Her Excellency Hannah Jara, who is the ambassador of Palestine to South Africa, and all three of them will try and unpack this question that we are asking this evening. Because this conversation is not only just limited to the three panelist members. If ever you are watching this webinar and you want to contribute, remember you can do so on our social media platforms, DECO_ZA. That is where you can send in your question, your comment. Perhaps you have an opposing view to what the panelist members will be raising tonight. You are welcome to do so. If you can call us, our studio line is 027 if you're outside of South Africa, 027 329 and you can send in your question. We're going to start off with you, Mr. Dango, as the host of the webinar. Just your opening remarks in regards to this question. The unilateral decision of the African Union Commission chair to grant Israel observer status. What are your thoughts on this? How do we open this discussion?
Thank you, Kaya. And I'm glad you corrected the social media tag that called me professor. I did lecture at bits, but I haven't earned the stripes of professor yet. One day I'll earn all these titles of professor, ambassador, etc. But for now, I'm just Mr. Thank you for that. Just to come back to the main question, maybe to take it from two perspectives. The one is the procedural issue. So South Africa objected to the decision by the AU Commission to grant Israel observer status. And we based this on the fact that whilst the chair had, it's within his mandate, or the chair of the AU, the chairperson of the AU to make such a decision, it has to do this on the basis of the principles of the African Union, specifically its constitutive act. So we raised both a procedural objection and also substantive issues that we think should be discussed. And that's what our minister presented at the Executive Council last week, stating that any decision that is this serious must be consulted extensively within the membership of the AU, and not just a decision by the chairperson. The fact that you had over 25 countries formally objecting meant that it had to be raised at the Executive Council. This decision is now being referred to heads of state for further discussion. But if I may, just as part of my opening remarks, just talk about what we mean by the substantive issues and the Constitutive Act. So if you look at the Constitutive Act of the AU, it has a clause there that talks about the need of member states to promote and protect the human rights of people in accordance with the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. Now, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights is part of the legal framework of the AU and has got significant status within the AU. So if you go to the preamble itself of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, it talks very specifically, and if you will bear with me, that member states must be conscious of their duty to achieve the total liberation of Africa, the people of which are still struggling for their dignity and genuine independence, and undertaking to eliminate colonialism, neocolonialism, apartheid, Zionism, to dismantle the aggressive foreign military bases and all forms of discrimination, language, religion, or any other political status. So you can see within that particular clause, which is in the preamble of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, not only is the term apartheid used, but the term Zionism is used very explicitly as well. And this is where we talk about the substantive issues that the members must be engaged with before any decision like this must be made to readmit Israel as an observer to the AU. Remember, Israel was an observer under the OAU, but when the AU was formed based on these kind of legal frameworks, and the strong anti-colonial stance taken within the legal documents of the African Union, Israel was sort of ousted as an observer. Just to sort of conclude, just last week on the 19th of October, Daniel Levi of the U.S. Middle East Project briefed the United States Security Council. And Levi, on behalf of that institution, calls for a rights-based approach to ending the occupation of Palestine. But he then specifically mentions that Israeli human rights groups have since joined Palestinian and other human rights groups across the world, where they are calling for a legal designation that the crime of apartheid and related persecution is being committed by Israel against Palestinians. So you can see that there is a growing sense that what has been the approach to peace talks cannot continue, that there's a growing call for some kind of determination that this is indeed a crime against apartheid. And when you have a legal instrument such as the African Charter on People and Human Rights actually calling issues by its name, apartheid and Zionism, we think that it's untenable that a decision by the chairperson of the AU could be made without consulting these documents, including a legal opinion that has been done by the AU previously, that Israel cannot be an observer state to the AU because of the principles of the African Union. And it's on this basis that South Africa objected. It's on this basis that Nigeria objected. It's on this basis that 23 other countries joined us in this objection. And it's substantive, and we are calling for this decision to be discussed by all member states, not just on the procedures, but actually the substance as member states are guided by these very important documents and clauses that I've just highlighted. Thanks.
Mr. Tengo, I will come back to you, and we are going to talk about the issue of extensive consultation at a later stage. But right now, let me move to Mr. Mohamed Desai. The Africa for Palestine on the 28th of July, that was, I think it was 6 days after this decision was made, released a statement, and you were in support objection by the South African government to this decision. Can you tell me more about your stance as Africa for Palestine and why that you are in support of the South African government?
Thanks so much, Kaya. I think that as a member of civil society, as a civil society organization, we firstly start off with the position of welcoming the South African government's very firm position, as has been articulated by our president, by President Cyril Ramaphosa, and in addition by the Minister of International Relations, Minister Naledi Pandor. We appreciate the fact that the messages on the streets of South Africa are translating into political positions held by the South African state. This is seeing a parallel. This is seeing a continuity between what civil society, what members of the public are calling for, and what the state is doing in our name. We concur with the South African government that the decision was unwarranted and entirely unjustified for both the reasons that Mr. Dango has outlined, the legal reasons, the legal basis, the policy positions of the African Union, which are being trampled upon by the chairperson in this process. But in addition, as members of the African continent, we are appalled that bodies that claim to represent us can take such positions, cozying up to Israel, when in fact such bodies should be opposed to Israel's policies of apartheid occupation, as this racism at a street level. But we also see various officials from within the Israeli government spewing such hatred. For example, just a few years ago, Israel's Minister of Culture had claimed that had compared African people to a cancer upon society. She later apologized, but she did not apologize to Africans. She apologized to cancer victims to suggest that Africans should never have even been compared to cancer because Africans are even worse than cancer. This is the kind of sentiment that is being held by politicians in Israel, by official state representatives, and that the chairperson of the African Union could try to allow Israel to enter such a body is absolutely perplexing. But furthermore, I think that together with the governments, the over 20 governments that have come out from the African continent clearly opposing this decision, we at a civil society level are working with our partners in both the SADC region, but also in the various other African countries to ensure that this decision is going to be reversed by both political influence, but in addition also because of the voices coming from the streets of these African countries, from our African states.
And now we are going to Her Excellency Ambassador Jara, the Ambassador of Palestine to South Africa. Ambassador, Palestine is a country that has been experiencing, I don't even know how we put it into words, how we explain the visuals now that we have access to media and what is happening even in countries that are outside our countries, who are able to see what is happening in Palestine. And this has been an ongoing oppression for over 50 years. But here we are today. We are having this conversation about Israel being granted an observer status by the African Union chairperson. As Palestine, when you heard that, what was your initial reaction, and what is still your stance on that currently?
Well, first of all, thank you for hosting me on this an important webinar, explanatory one, let's say. And in this regard, I would like to recall what my Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dr. Riyad Al-Malki, has stated during his last visit to South Africa at the beginning of this month, when he said that, when he highlighted that it was so strange that at a time when the world looks at Israel as an apartheid state, the African Union discusses Israel admission as an observer. We really find it quite awkward that this position by the African Union in this international context is taking place right now, because during the last war on Gaza and during the latest events in Jerusalem and the Israeli violence that has been used against the Palestinian people, we witnessed that the international community, the streets, the people in Europe, in United States, and even in some African countries, especially in South Africa, has been into the streets supporting the Palestinian people, which marks a kind of a change or a shift in the public opinion, as you mentioned, because of the unofficial platforms that has been given to the people, and especially to the young, through the social media platforms, changing the mainstream media and the mainstream stereotype about the relationship between Palestinians and Israelis. We find it quite shocking and awkward that this decision has been taken right now by the African Union, and since there has been no change in the position of Israel. On the contrary, Israel now is more violent. Israel now is labeled as an apartheid state. Israel now is still a violent occupying power and is still an expansionist regime. So what has been changed to grant Israel this status now in this context? This is what we find awkward. And this also takes us to the history. I mean, Palestine has been always supported by the African Union member states and its leaders, and by the African people. African nations have regarded the Palestinian struggle as an African issue, and this is a reflection of the bonds between Africa's liberation and anti-colonial struggle and those of the Palestinian people. It is within this context, then, that the decision by the African Union Commission chairperson is to unilaterally accept the credentials of the Israel's ambassador to Ethiopia is all the more bewildering. This move actually undermines the anti-colonial values of the African Union. So, and we as Palestinians, we really don't consider this only as a Palestinian issue. We consider it also as an issue that will harm the African unity itself. I mean, look at the African Union. There was a split, there was a division. So this is what Israel is always bringing into such platforms. As Palestinians, we are not against Israel gaining any status in an international platform when it is a normal state. But when it is an apartheid state, when it is an occupying power, we do believe that it should be boycotted. And we do believe that granting such a status in this context is a privilege that Israel doesn't deserve now, especially in the African continent, who is still suffering from apartheid and from discrimination. If we are looking at the context, what Israel is offering the African continent that the international market can't offer. It only offers civilians services, army bargains, and so on. So why this move at this particular time?
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Well, if you've just joined us, I am in conversation with Mr. Zane Dango, who is the special advisor to the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation in South Africa, as well as Her Excellency Hannah Jha, who is the ambassador of Palestine to South Africa, Mr. Desai, Mohammed Desai, who is the director at Africa for Palestine. We are talking about the African Union Commission Chairperson's unilateral decision to admit or to grant Israel observer status in the African Union. Going back to you, Mr. Jengo, the question might be, or rather the argument might be, there are a number of non-African states that have been granted observer status in the African Union, and it has never been something to make noise about. It has been a non-event, as one of Clayton Munyala put it in one of his statements that he made this week. But then again, you'd find that the argument by the African is that there are 55 member states in the African Union. To consult each and every state might be an administrative nightmare. What would be your response to that?
So there's many states and also NGOs that are granted or accredited as observers to the African Union. I think the difference with the state of accusation is a statement of fact. There's a wall opinion by the International Court of Justice that confirms that. And increasingly, the kinds of oppression that is taking place is being looked at from within the lens of the Convention Against Apartheid. And it's within that context and the clause that I've mentioned that there's very few, in terms of the UN resolutions 1514 and 2232, for example, that deals with colonization. There's very few states that are still outrightly regarded as colonial states, and this is one of them. Of the AU being founded on the principles of anti-colonialism, anti-occupation, and having expressly included in its constitutive and founding documents the issue of Zionism and colonialism. That is why when the AU was formed, the State of Israel was removed as an observer, and that is why we felt that consultation on such a fundamental issue shouldn't be one around merely having the administrative right to accredit. That based on the principles and values of the AU, there was an onus on the chair of the AU Commission to consult with member states. And once the objections were coming in, were perhaps calling for urgent consultation that would have been necessary, instead of what we saw at the Executive Council, an attempt to kick it down the road for further discussions in a manner that may not be too consultative. So I think in this case, given the seriousness of the issue and how close it is to the ethos of the founding of the OAU, or the Organization of African of the OAU and the UN of the AU, that the chair needed to consult extensively, and we still believe that this issue needs to be discussed on its principles, not on procedure as much, but on the principles of who can be observers to the AU and who cannot be. And these decisions must be made in line with the principles and values of the AU. And I think that differentiates this from many other states and also NGOs that are accredited to the AU.
One might pose a question that we have seen scores of people losing their lives due to the conflict that we are seeing in the Middle East. What is hindering a two-state solution to this problem?
Is that for me?
For Ambassador.
Oh.
Sorry, again?
My question to you is that saying that scores of lives have been lost in this conflict, one might pose a question: what is hindering a two-state solution to the current problem?
Well, our issue is not as complicated as Israel is trying always to promote. The Palestinian struggle has started in 1948 with a simple equation that Israel occupied Palestine, and now the occupation is continuing for 73 years. We engaged into a peace process in 1994 with the objective of achieving peace, abandoning like 70-80% of historical or mandatory Palestine for the sake of peace. Unfortunately, after that long time, we are stuck with no results. On the contrary, we are gaining more casualties. On the level of the Palestinian people losing their lives for the sake of nothing. And in this regard, Israel did not only stop on that level, they continue their aggression against Palestinian people. Our land is grabbed on a daily basis for the sake of an expansionist settlement project. Gaza has been under blockade and siege for 14 years now, witnessing 4 consecutive wars. The latest was last May, with more than 200 people dying, mainly from children, women, and elderly people. Unfortunately, this situation jeopardizes the two-state solution. Actually, it dismantle the idea of the two-state solution. But until this moment, on the table, backed by the international community, we have no other option but the two-state solution. And unfortunately and shockingly, we can say that the international community is silent on the Israeli practices against the Palestinian people. And on the contrary, they are welcoming Israel into their international platforms like the African Union, which makes it even harder for us to even put on the table another alternatives or other options for the solution. Until now, we do believe that the two-state solution is jeopardized by the Israeli practices on the ground, but still, it is the only paradigm that we can move around, because for any solution to be agreed upon, it should be agreed upon and backed by the international community. Until this moment, we have no alternative. President Mahmoud Abbas, in his speech in front of the UN General Assembly last September, he called for an international conference for peace to find a solution for maybe the two-state solution, or to find a solution for the whole issue in general. Unfortunately, we did not receive any hint from any other country or international organization. And look what we are receiving on the other hand. We are receiving like signs from the African Union welcoming Israel as an observer status. So it's a little bit complicated, difficult, but we will continue working toward our goals. Maybe we will grab some sign from the international community.
Mr. Desai, this is a conflict that has been going on for over 50 years. And one might ask that, what is the effectiveness of lending solidarity in situations like these by organizations such as Africa for Palestine?
Kaya, thanks for putting it within the context of solidarity, and specifically this decision that is trying to be pushed through the African Union. I think that the campaign by Israel to try to enter the African Union actually tramples on this value of solidarity, which was really a cornerstone of many of our liberation struggles. The chairperson of the African Union, by allowing a colonial state, an occupying state, a state that is guilty of violations of international law, into the African Union, is really trampling on the history of our peoples and on the legacy of our heroes. Kwame Nkrumah, Kenneth Kaunda, Samora Machel, Oliver Tambo, these were friends of the Palestinian struggle. Now, we were not friends back then out of charity or as a favor. And today we don't oppose Israel's apartheid regime against the oppressed Palestinians out of charity or as a favor. We do this because it was during the darkest days of our own anti-colonial struggles here in South Africa, but also more generally in the African continent, that during those hardest of times that we experienced, it was the Palestinians who gave us financial assistance, who gave us military training, and who gave us various other forms of diplomatic and other support during our various anti-colonial struggles on the continent. And this legacy is really what the chairperson of the African Union is trampling on. In addition to the ideological and policy considerations that Mr. Dango has outlined, and of course the organizational jeopardy that the chairperson is putting the African Union into by creating such a split and by not following proper protocols. Solidarity is something that has been infused into the African continent because we were beneficiaries of this great and potent gift. But this is also something that we lend to the people of Cuba, that we lend to the people of Palestine, and we lend to any other oppressed people across the world. And this solidarity has translated from the streets of our various countries into a very concrete action. So during the campaign against apartheid in South Africa, you had millions of people across the world that made our struggle their struggle. Likewise, today, you have the Presbyterian Church of Southern Africa, the Methodist Church of Southern Africa, you have the United Congregational Church of South Africa, you have the Anglican Church that have all adopted in the last 10 years various boycott of Israel resolutions. You have major corporations and pension funds, the Norwegian pension fund, which is the second largest such pension fund in the world, that have all withdrawn investments from Israel. You have various artists, Salif Keita of Mali. You have artists in South Africa across the spectrum, from hip hop through to jazz and classic, that have all come out in support of the cultural boycott of Israel. And this has not only been a PR exercise of solidarity, it has also translated into, for example, the United Nations a few years ago, documenting how Israel has lost 46% in foreign direct investments as a result of the international boycotts and the international isolation that the Israeli regime is currently facing. And so these attempts by Israel needs to be put into the larger context of where Israel fits into the global community. Firstly, as a serial violator of international law, it is unwelcomed in the African Union. Secondly, as an African Union that has values of solidarity and of an anti-colonial spirit, Israel is not welcomed. But furthermore, Israel is also very desperate to become normalized in the international community because of its abnormal status currently. And just as how apartheid South Africa once had this abnormal label, Israel today also has this abnormality that it needs to correct by ending its violations of international law and ending its oppression of the Palestinian people.
Mr. Dango, you mentioned that there are over 20 African states who are against this decision. But one might question that Israel has about diplomatic relations with about 46 or over 40 African states. And you find that some African states would argue that, well, we might disagree with Israel on a political level, but we can still have economic ties with Israel. Now, that begs the question, if South Africa, together with other countries who are opposing this decision, do you have a leg to stand on to ensure that the African Union changes this decision?
So I think we need to differentiate the bilateral relations that countries engage in with the African Union itself. So the fact that you've got over 40 countries that have diplomatic relations over varying periods of time, some starting from the founding of the State of Israel close to 73 years ago, and others more recently, we should differentiate from the fact that none of these states, including ours, have explicit prohibitions against engaging with a state that could be tagged as being apartheid and equating Zionism with apartheid, which the African Charter on Human and People's Rights does. And it's for that very specific reason that the AU as a body excluded Israel as an observer status because of its values of decolonialism. To equate the fact that you have bilateral relations, with over 40 countries on the continent, to being a blanket acceptance of Israel as an observer state and its policies is a misnomer. And it's a non-argument that's being made by those who have made it in the last few weeks. South Africa has diplomatic relations with Israel. We've downscaled it in protest. It doesn't mean that we have forms of diplomatic relations that we accept what the policies that Israel stands for. And just recently, South Africa, together with Namibia and Palestinian and Israeli NGOs, hosted a seminar. Sort of an online seminar, but on the margins of the UN, where we engage with the fact that should we talk about a human rights-based approach on both sides of the Green Line, that is in the occupied territories and in what is now known as the historical Palestine, or the state of Israel. That is the question. So none of in this conversation it's been mentioned that a few countries have lobbied for Israel to be an observer status. Liberia is the only one that has come forward at the Executive Council and said we are one of those states. But as the Foreign Minister of Nigeria pointed out, none of these states were really consulted in a coordinated way. It was after the fact that it's mentioned that part of the decision making is based on the bilateral relations that many countries have with the State of Israel. But again, as our minister and the Minister of Nigeria pointed out, that is not the manner in which do they make a decision around the AU as a legal entity on its own and as the body that brings together all African states. So we made clear that should not be the way in which we engage, and that the values and spirits of the African Union should prevail in engaging with a state that has been seen as being against the spirit of anti-colonialism and anti-occupation. And that is the manner in which we engaging with this decision, is don't just look at the bilateral issues, look at the actual overall position of the AU in relation to being an anti-colonial entity, an entity that has repeatedly expressed itself against the occupation, the occupation of Palestine, and the fact that the ICJ, which is the apex body, the legal body of the UN, has called Israel an occupying power. These are the issues that we should be using to decide when the AU accepts any country or NGO as an observer status or not. And this includes the State of Israel.
Ambassador Jara, you said that the international community is silent, and one might wonder what you mean by that, because the United Nations, for instance, about 48 hours ago had a discussion on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. What do you mean when you say that the international community is silent? Are there particular or specific entities or countries that you feel should say something that will hold weight in resolving this conflict?
Yes, I said so because when we talk in this regard of the Palestinian issue, words without actions are meaningless, which means that UN decisions, whether General Assembly or Security Council or whatsoever, are only literature. When it comes to Israel, there is no real actions that really put Israel in its real place as an occupying power, as an expansionist regime, as an apartheid state. This is what I meant. We do believe that international community should take actions against Israel to bring this apartheid regime down, exactly as it took actions before against the apartheid in South Africa. It was the international community, the international solidarity that brought the apartheid in South Africa to an end. And this is what we are demanding from the international community. And I really would like to add that to associate our African brothers and sisters who have fought colonialism and apartheid for decades must not be associated with the longest and most brutal colonial project in the world today. Indeed, we do believe that Israel's observer membership would contradict and make mockery of the very foundational principles of the African Union, the purposes and principles of its charter, and the African Union resolutions on Palestine. So we do believe that international community should be associating actions with words in order to bring an end to this colonial regime in the 21st century. This is what I meant by talking this language. We do believe that withdrawal of Israel's observer status is a necessary validation of the African Union's commitment toward its broader anti-colonialism and anti-apartheid political strategy. That's why also I would love to refer to the previous question that you directed to Mr. Zain. And it's exactly the same excuse that the chairperson of the African Union used by saying that Israel's diplomatic relations with the African Union member state justify his decision to grant Israel an African Union observer status. But this decision is not about whether Israeli diplomatic of colonialism that comes with attaining observer status in an institution that serves as an anti-colonial base. Giving Israel an observer status is like an institution that talks in one side and their actions are on an opposite different side. So this is what I meant, that international community should associate actions with words, otherwise the words would be meaningless.
Mr. Dango, now the question is, apart from being vocal critics and being vehemently opposed to this decision, what is the way forward? Is South Africa, together with other AU member states, what is the plan?
So on the issue of ending the occupation, I think the ambassador spoke about the equation, what happened to apartheid South Africa. Remember that you had a groundswell of opposition globally against the apartheid state, leading to actions at the UN, which wasn't just about words in terms of resolutions, there was actions. There was enforceable action against countries and corporations in some cases that went against UN resolutions against the crime of apartheid you had a committee on apartheid that was established. And this is where we are seeing a lot of the negotiations and discussions going to, is to question, for example, why there is still such acceptance of the occupation, and as argued by B'Tselem, which is the leading human rights organization in Israel, and other Palestinian NGOs, that you have a de facto apartheid regime operating and is doing so with a sense of impunity in the international world. So we are making sure that we take this kind of discussion into the international community, into the UN system, so that the differential approaches to South Africa and the state of Israel are discussed. We will also engage, I know we've made this quite clear, we will engage together with the AU and other role players in ensuring that meaningful talks around ending the occupation takes place. Real meaningful talks, not talks that actually, as David Levi pointed out, is actually circular, leading to the entrenchment of negative actions, leading to what is called the fait accompli, where the talks lay the basis for continued settlements, and the talks faltering and starting, actually resulting in more land being occupied. And what we're calling for is genuine talks, whether it's around the two-state solution, whether it's, as Levi and others are suggesting, a more fundamental rights-based approach on both sides of the Green Line. South Africa is ready to engage and be part of that kind of discussions with the AU, and of course with being led and guided by the Palestinians on what should happen in this case. Coming back to the decision by the African Union chairperson, we note that the Executive Council, a decision was made by the chair of the Executive Council that this decision will now be taken by heads of states, and we hope that in the period between the Executive Council and the heads of state meeting, that there will be further discussions amongst member states around the principles, so that by the time this discussion is tabled at the heads of state level, there's more clarity that this is not a procedural issue, but a substantive issue, as South Africa, Nigeria, and others emphasized at the Executive Council meeting.
Well, before we close off the conversation, we had a number of questions, but I think some you had already responded to, Mr. Tengo. One was that South Africa and Botswana boast direct relations with Israel, and at some point, South Africa even made threats to withdraw or downgrading the embassy in Jerusalem, which is the US recognizes as opposed to Tel Aviv. Could one say South Africa makes hot noise on the other hand, and whilst dealing and trading with Israel? And that is a question that you have already answered. And this was from Theo Mukwena, a media student at North University. And the second question is from Will Vilagazi. He is saying that one can argue that it is better to talk on one table, including your enemies and your not so friendly foes. Why do the opposing countries in Africa not see this? Is it the same reason used to allow Morocco back into the fold? Because they are still a colonial power over Western Sahara. And the argument was that it's between the two countries from the inside to talk about these issues. So what is your response to that, Mr. J?
Thanks. Let me just come to the second issue, two countries. So when we go back 73 years, we saw a decision made by a very small number of states that then made up the United Nations to balkanize historical Palestine into two, laying the basis for the occupation of Palestine. So you don't have a symmetrical two states. You've got an occupying power and occupied people, and equating these as almost parties with the same power to come around the same table and negotiate is a misnomer. And this is why we're saying that this is not about the two parties which actually have different forms of power coming together and thrashing things out. You need the support of the international community, just like the oppressed people in South Africa had the support of the international community, that builds up the kind of pressure where meaningful talks take place. And meaningful talks taking place means that there's an end to the occupation, there's the respect for international law. If you talk about a two-state solution, for example, that it has to be around the 1967 borders, and that all the issues that are unresolved, including the right of return of many, many Palestinian refugees in places like Jordan and other parts of the diaspora, have the right to return, that the issue of East Jerusalem is dealt with. And these are the kind of issues that have to be put on the table, and these are real discussions, and there's power dynamics within this that cannot just be left to two. One is that one of the biggest armies in the world, which is the State of Israel, a nuclear power, and really, balkanized Palestinian territories this is what one has to take into consideration. Coming to the issue of Morocco and the issue of Western Sahara, South Africa is on record as having voted against that decision for the same reasons that we felt that, the ICJ too has called Morocco an occupying power. And we are very consistent in the manner in which we engage with these issues. So we took the same stance in relation to the re-entry of Morocco. We were, in the end, it was a vote, and we were a minority in that voting pattern. Just to clarify, we've been very consistent about the role that any country, whether they're in Africa or outside of Africa, that may be classified by the ICJ and others as occupying powers, and in relation to the AU, we've been very consistent in that.
Well, the last question, Mr. Deng, I think.
Sorry, Kaya, I can't hear you. I think I've lost you. I think I've lost the host. I didn't hear the last question, so maybe if you can repeat it for me.
Well, I'm actually experiencing technical challenges. Well, the question was, what will happen if the AU chair does not rescind his decision? What alternatives are there for the aggrieved parties?
Well, what we're hoping for is that the consultative process that emerges after the Executive Council, and as I suggested, is based on principle, and that member states come together and suggest that this decision be put in abeyance. And we're hoping that by the time the heads of state engage with this is the decision they would make, so that we don't have to have a vote in the AU about this issue. The fact that even one country disagrees with it means there's no consensus, and the practice in the AU is around consensus about observer status in Chile. We're hoping that we don't get to a situation where other options have to be considered. We think that sanity will prevail, and that based on the discussions like we had now about the values and principles of the African Union, this decision will be rescinded. Not purely because on the procedural issues that some have put forward, but purely because of the substantive value that the African Union puts on decolonization, anti-colonialism, and anti-occupation, and that this will be the basis on which agreement is fostered within the African Union.
We do believe, we do hope that the African Union will rescind the observer status of Israel to the African Union, taking into consideration that this is not the first time that Israel is applying for this status. Maybe this is the third time in different stages. And we do believe that nothing has changed on the status of Israel as an occupying power, as an apartheid state now, so that will enable the African Union to accept it. So we do believe that this decision, as Mr. Zain will be rescinded due to two important facts: the procedural issue and the substantive issue. And as the Palestinian people, we continue to look to our African brothers and sisters for support and solidarity in our struggle against Israel's illegal settler colonialism and apartheid. And we do believe as Palestinians that our fight for a world free of racism is an ongoing and shared struggle from the streets of Jerusalem in Palestine to the streets of Abuja, Nairobi, and Johannesburg. We have a shared duty to ensure that the normalization of our dehumanization, demonization, and colonialization is rooted out once and for all. As the legacy of the Madiba stated once, that as Africans we are not free until Palestine free. We still count on this legacy among the Africans, and we still look forward to a brighter future together, hopefully.
Well, I had lost connection for a few minutes there, so I'm not too sure if Mr. Desai, you have also given your remarks. If not, so then the floor is yours.
Thanks, Kaya. I think at the end of the day, beyond our positions on policy and on the larger theoretical and ideological issues, we must remember what we are opposing. We are opposing a government that killed more than 230 people in less than 10 days, more than 65 of them children under the age of 16, and 3 pregnant women. Just a few years ago, Israel also killed 2,500 Palestinians in a period of less than 2 months. More than 551 of them were children under the age of 16. This is the kind of violence that we are opposing. And we as Africa for Palestine, as civil society, are very confident that with the leadership that is being shown by the South African government, by Namibia, by Botswana, by various other countries across our continent, Algeria and others, that we will indeed emerge from this situation, having not having Israel as part of the African Union. We will emerge from this as a better entity. We will emerge from this in a form that would make those that came before us proud of where the African Union is and where the African continent is going.
So much. Thank you so much, Mr. Desai. Well, Mr. Dango, as the host, if I'm calling you for the second time, that's not a problem. You can close off our discussion for today.
No, thank you, Kaya. Just to thank you and our colleagues at DIRCO for hosting Ubuntu Radio, for hosting this discussion, and also for the ambassador and Mohammed Desai's participation. This is a very important discussion for us, and we hope to have more platforms like this where we can discuss not just this decision about the observer status, but to begin to discuss with other stakeholders in South Africa and the region about what should and can be done to ensure that a similar process that was followed to ending the state of apartheid is followed to actually end the occupation. And South Africa is willing to play a meaningful role in engaging with all stakeholders in the region and beyond around that particular subject. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was Mr. Zain Dango, who is the Special Advisor to the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation in South Africa, Dr. Naledi Pandor, as well as a Director at the Africa for Palestine, Mohammed Desai. Her Excellency Hanan Jar, who is the Ambassador for Palestine to South Africa. We're talking about the unilateral decision that was taken by the African Union Commission Chairperson, that is Chairperson Moussa Faki Mahamat. And this is a decision that was met with strong objection by more than 20 African countries. We're yet to see if ever this decision will be changed. But one thing that the panelists agree on, that it is an unjust and an appalling decision that needs to change, because Israel at the present moment does not deserve an observer status. Well, we'll be back again with another webinar and where, at what time it will be happening. But if you've missed this conversation, you can find this recording on our social media platform.